This story is about performance reviews and the moment that someone realizes that the system behind them may not work the way that they had assumed it did. As with the previous story, some details have been generalized to protect the privacy of the people and the organizations involved, but the dynamics are real. This was my first corporate job after university, and I came into it energized, eager to contribute, and eager to prove myself. And I assumed something fairly simple. If you worked hard, performed well, and took on responsibility, the system would eventually recognize that. Effort in, advancement out. Performance review season felt important, almost ceremonial. Calendar invites would go out weeks in advance. There were self-assessments, manager evaluations, conversations about growth. It felt like the formal mechanism where contribution would eventually translate into trajectory. Before the reviews happened, people talked about them. Quietly, not formally, but in passing conversations. People would often speculate about how things might go, who had a strong year, who had taken on more responsibility, who had struggled. There was an assumption that the process would reflect what everyone could already see, that visible differences in contribution would eventually show up in outcomes. Looking back, that assumption probably came from how the system is described. Performance reviews are often framed as the mechanism that recognizes contribution and adjusts trajectory. But living through that cycle revealed something slightly different. In our department, performance differences were visible. Some people consistently handled more volume, more complex issues, more responsibility. Others met expectations and stayed within their defined scope and avoided major mistakes. And a few regularly required correction. The variance wasn't subtle. You could see it in workflow. You could see it in who problem tasks would flow towards, and you could see it in who others relied on. And when my review came, the feedback was strong. Specific examples, clear acknowledgement of output, clear acknowledgement of contribution, and at first, that felt validating. The meeting itself felt formal. There was a document, metrics, notes about my performance over the year. The conversation covered strengths, areas of growth, and future potential. The tone was very positive and encouraging. The kind of conversation that makes you feel like your effort has been noticed. There were phrases like strong contributor and valuable to the team. At that point in my career, I interpreted that kind of feedback very literally. If the contribution was clear, I assumed that the outcomes would eventually reflect that. And looking back, I think that assumption was probably part of being new to that environment. But as the review cycle finished across the team, I began to notice something. I noticed that the raise percentages didn't strongly track the visible differences in everyone's contribution. Those who consistently volunteered for additional responsibility received modest increases, and those who stayed comfortable within the defined scope received increases not dramatically different. The gap between exceeding expectations and meeting expectations was far narrower than I assumed it would be. Recognition language varied more than structural outcomes did. At first, I assumed there must be more happening behind the scenes, and that maybe the differences would show up later. Maybe future opportunities would reflect those contributions. But as time passed, the pattern stayed consistent. Recognition happened and documentation happened, but the structural differences between people who exceeded expectations and those who met them remained relatively narrow. That's when the realization started to form. Not that performance reviews were meaningless, but that they might be designed for a different purpose than I had originally assumed. At first, it wasn't something I reacted to strongly. It was more of a quiet realization. The system clearly recognized differences in contribution. Managers spoke about them, they documented them, and they acknowledged them. But the structural outcomes remained tightly grouped. And that subtle difference changes how a system is interpreted, because people will eventually learn which signals matter. Language matters, recognition matters, but structural signals, compensation, authority, and trajectory tend to shape behavior more strongly over time. And when those signals move within narrow ranges, people begin to understand the boundaries of the system, not through policy, but through observation. You could also see how people interpreted the outcomes. Some employees who had pushed hard during the year began adjusting their efforts slightly, not dramatically, just subtly. And others who had stayed comfortably within scope saw that the outcomes weren't dramatically different, and that observation spreads quietly in any workplace. People watch how systems behave, and over time, they calibrate their effort based on what those systems appear to reward. Not based on what they say they reward, but based on what actually happens. On paper, performance reviews appear differentiated. There are ratings, categories, scorecards, but structurally, variance is often compressed. High performers receive stronger language, lower performers receive corrective language, but dramatic swings in compensation, authority, or trajectory are rare. Compensation bands remain stable, hierarchy remains intact, advancement remains controlled. That may not be a flaw, it may be intentional. And from a company's perspective, that kind of narrow range is understandable. Budgets are finite. Payroll needs to remain predictable, and large differences in raises introduce comparison and friction, which then the managers, they have to justify those differences across the team. Flattened ranges simplify planning, they reduce volatility, they make forecasting easier. That isn't necessarily unfair, it's structural. But structural choices always carry incentive consequences. Organizations communicate values in two ways: symbolically through language, and structurally through compensation, authority, and trajectory. If symbolic differentiation is strong, but structural differentiation is narrow, the signal becomes mixed. And mixed signals will shape behavior. When exceeding expectations produces only marginally different financial outcomes than meeting expectations, the rational response becomes calibration. Not disengagement, adjustment. And over time, effort aligns more closely with guaranteed outcomes rather than a theoretical reward. And at the same time, if meeting baseline expectations produces similar outcomes, urgency to dramatically exceed them weakens. The variance narrows, the middle expands. The organization becomes more stable, but potentially less dynamic. Performance reviews may not primarily exist to maximize differentiation. They may exist to create documentation, standardize feedback cycles, provide legal defensibility, and maintain managerial rhythm. And those are all legitimate organizational needs. But they are different from incentive optimization. If a system is built for stability and documentation, dramatic divergence becomes unlikely. If the gap between exceeding expectations and meeting expectations is narrow, what behavior does that system quietly encourage over time? Consistency? Risk avoidance? Moderation? If recognition varies more than outcomes do, what signal are people actually responding to? And what would a review system look like if it meaningfully differentiated contribution without destabilizing the organization? That tension sits quietly beneath many modern workplaces.